Okay, this is all filming.
Oh, my baby hair. Hi.
We are The White Pube. We write about art.
At the moment we are here because Air got us in to be cretins in residence.
I'm Anna. I think I'm the founder of Air, which kind of happened without quite realising up in Archway 13 years ago. I did train originally as an architect, and I think architecture is really important. It's an extraordinary discipline of thinking and building a kind of, the design process is part of how I think. And maybe that can be very helpful to know about the timeline of making things happen, and also working with a lot of people. Architects don't make buildings, they're just a little part of it. So when I started working with artists, I was slightly surprised sometimes that the artists could kind of or either be expected or could expect to do the whole thing. I was like, oh, but it's much more interesting when you have more people kind of colliding on something, because then we do something we would never have expected. So the doing with, I was aware of the lack of that, maybe. I did various... How did it come out? I've always worked with artists, and maybe some people called me an artist quite early on because I made things, but I wouldn't have used that label. I got involved in more educational work, kind of learning outside the classroom when I was bringing up 2 kids, and being an architect just didn't really work. And maybe that's where some of the interest in being in places in different ways came out. So whether it was I remember taking some young people in Bristol for a walk in the woods just behind the school, and this kind of quite surreal realisation that they didn't go into that place and they didn't kind of have a sense of ownership of that place. So maybe one of the things from architecture that came is that I would often be working at the edge of the building. I was really interested in the spaces between buildings more than the actual, or what was going on within rather than the actual structure. And I think it's that time. So maybe it comes from growing up on a farm, and that there's a cycle, and that every season has something happening, and something about the space in between. And then maybe the more and more artists I met, and I realised this really important role to question, to make questions, and to make things that support questions, and that doesn't happen enough in the built environment, in the city, in the kind of systems of our world. So maybe that in a little way I could help kind of push that and prod that. And I think I'd been making work with artists and theatre makers in empty buildings around London since the late 80s. So one of the things that was different about London 30 years ago now is there was much more availability of space, and we see this in other cities. So I actually qualified as an architect without a building in my final portfolio. It was a little bit contentious. But my final project was in what's now the Oxo... Well, it is the Oxo Tower, but it was completely derelict, the whole building. And I made, an installation in the tower that explored the seasons of the city, moonlight in particular, and the fact that you couldn't experience moonlight in London because of light pollution, but also my very tentative early feminist questions that why had no women been to the moon? So I was born obviously at a time when going to the moon was like a real big deal. It's been forgotten about. So occupying spaces like that. So I used to go up into the Oxo Tower days and days on end. I used to go along every morning, and there was one security guard, been interested in security guards ever since, at the entrance of this massive derelict site, and I used to trundle in, up the flights of stairs, up into the tower, and didn't really know what I was doing, but I would spend time there, and eventually it became this, I think, quite lovely piece of work actually. But anyway, and then I brought people up there to experience it. So there's something about finding new views of the city, finding a new view of ourselves and how we connect with other people by being in places in different ways. Maybe that's where it started. There was a series of works in collaboration with some artists, including at Hornsey Road Bars, which was a derelict three swimming pools. It's now housing and platform youth centre. Some billboards on the Holloway Road we made performance works on. So the work was often moving and very much about bodies, and maybe that's where the kind of schism with architecture was. Actually, it was the bodies that I was really interested in, the bodies in the context of spaces in the city. So that's the foundation of how architecture and being in the world kind of collide for me, and those continue. So recently I've been working, maybe the last 10 years, had the privilege of working with dancers and realising about this incredible discipline of making work with your body or with someone else's body in choreography, and bringing that acknowledgement of movement more into the way that we're working, and that I've actually started making work a little bit myself again with my own body, which was a bit of a shock. But then, as Tilly said to me, but that's what you have your body, and that's what so many of the artworks I'm really interested to acknowledge, is that we all have an embodied experience of being here, being in a place. Air started, it's the only time I ever answered an advert in The Guardian. People used to get jobs because they were adverts in newspapers. And it was an advert, I can't remember the name of the job title. Oh, I can! It was the old PM one, project manager, which, I then kind of contested for a long time, because I think there's something about how do we support artists to make extraordinary work. If you project manage, that means you're kind of hidden away in the background, maybe on a computer. And I think the most supportive thing is about being present in a space, in a place, whatever that place is, alongside the artist, maybe before the artist, maybe after the artist, but with the process of art making. And then that's not the question. The question, so that in The Guardian, the Byam Shaw advertised for an innovation money funded new project, but it was the most, I realise now, incredible thing, because no one said what it had to be. It was just to make some connections between the art school and the place. And of course the Byam Shaw had been in Archway for maybe 20 something years by then already. So lots of people, there were lots of existing connections. There were people who'd made works there, and there were people who lived there and taught there, or there were connections. But there was no kind of formal thinking about how could we do more. And it wasn't necessarily tied into kind of targets around recruitment or kind of community numbers. It was just, what could this be? And the wonderful Alistair Warman, who was principal of Byam Shaw, kind of took me on. I was obviously employed by Central St Martin's, but it was like, what can we do here? So initially it was, it's quite funny, Archway Investigations and Responses. And there was an existing fellowship. There were some funded fellowships, artist fellowships at the Byam Shaw, and Alistair was brilliant. He said, why don't you take on those fellowships, because those will buy you a bit of research time for artists. So we turned it from 4 to 3, so 3 artists to spend time in Archway and then make work as a consequence. So it wasn't about come here and do something, it was come here and just be here. And one of the earliest, so a couple of really significant early artists that helped define what air could be, both Ruth Ewan and Ruth McLennan, and they were both very, very generous about saying, well, I'm here and maybe this might mean working in these very different ways. So Ruth Ewan had met this amazing Archway resident, Fang, when she did this big Art Angel project, very, very young. I don't know if you've ever come across it. Did The Foot That Kissed You, I think it's called. Anyway, Fang, who sadly recently passed away, that's what happens in the... Oh, I love that. So in the cupboard, so this is our cupboard. We'll come back to the cupboard, I'm sure. Anyway, so it was kind of connecting with people and place, and then works happening as a consequence of that. And then I think Tilly, who's co-director of AIR, is now a public gardener, but is still very much part of the thinking and infrastructure. Do we have an infrastructure? She said what we do is that we find the slack, and it's within the slack that maybe something else can happen, and it's the else that could be a new kind of publicness, maybe. So that was in November 2006 I started in Archway, and it was initially like one of those 2-day-a-week kind of just make something happen, you're a project manager jobs. What does that mean? But I remember saying to Alice on the first day, what should I do? And he said, oh, I don't know. You work it out. Great! I didn't answer the question, who is AIR? It's whoever we're working with in a place at that time, and it really is about interrogating what collaborative practice might be. So a number of artists. So here in the Packington, there's 3 artists we're working with, lots of members of the community, people who live and work around here. At any one moment, I think that is AIR. And of course there's the kind of behind the scenes keeping it going bit, but it's about that group of people. Very important to be able to go and work in another place and go, what happens with this methodology? If the methodology is we're part of a place, we really know it, we've spent a long time here, what does it mean and we can test the dropping in, parachuting in thing, what happens when actually we do that? And what I think worked out was it's not all is lost. If you've got a commitment to people, genuinely a commitment to people, then we can work in other places. So by I'm sure late 2006, what on earth can this be? By early 2007 we were Archway Investigations and Responses. Not a big acronym person, but it was really great that it became AIR. And at that point we were funded by HIVE funding, Higher Education Innovation Fund. And our research question was what happens when we stay, which came out of that we didn't really know what we were doing. But if we've got a question, then people will take us a bit more seriously. Because one of the early things was, oh, are you the community arts woman? So that degree of suspicion from within the art school about why you would want to be in a place, why you'd want to be in conversation with other people, not just artists, there was some of that. We were in Archway, I think we did count about 350 artworks came as a result of AIR being in Archway. Some of those were teaching projects. We did a 5-year first year here in Archway, it was called. Amazing work came from those first years being present in Archway for kind of intensive 6-week thing, but also working with artists through fellowship research kind of schemes. Artists sometimes after they graduated from By I'm Sure would say, oh, I'm ready to make a piece of work here now. So different ways, and we were there to kind of react and support and be alongside artists, say yes, this needs to happen, let's make this happen. Funding from various organisations including Arts Council, Islington Council, Transport for London, those sorts of things. So different scales, but mostly very ephemeral, temporal, quite surprising works in streets, pavements, restaurants, laundrettes, libraries, that kind of. Then Central St Martin said, please could you come and do this in King's Cross? And that was slightly alarming because of course King's Cross was a completely different context, different institutional framework, really completely different scale of place. So we overlapped both for probably a year and a half. So I think completely moved the studio to King's Cross in 2013, maybe. And maybe one of the biggest shifts there was rather than having a space that was porous, to use Serena's word, to people both within the art school and without, we were put on a table or desk on the 4th floor staff room, which is completely inaccessible from anyone other than colleagues. So there was an immediate shift in how we could work, what it meant to be present in this place, King's Cross, and maybe that had a really good impact on all our walking work. And there were lots of things that happened, but by 2015, I wish I'd reviewed my dates, or 16. 2016, we were realising that it was no longer possible to kind of push this way of working within the institution. Or it could have been possible, but we would have just held a kind of... We got stuck, actually. So we set up as Tilly Fowler, and my co-director and I set up a community interest company. And our first piece of work, we responded to a tender from Newham Council and ended up in North Woolwich on Mud Island. And we're joined by the wonderful Gabrielle de la Puente and made Tidal Twirlings, a piece of work there. We were there for about 6 months. And the next major work, so there are little things going on, exploring other places and thinking about how it might be to work with artists and where we could land. And it was slightly alarming to think that we weren't landed. We made a piece of work in collaboration with Margot Bannerman in Tottenham called A Real Job, and that's an ongoing exploration about places of work and making. And then in 2018 began on the Packington Estate in Angel, where we are today, on having responded to a tender from Hyde Foundation, a housing association, to realise a Section 106 planning commitment here, but also to establish some kind of arts programme in the Packington.
Can you explain to me what Section 106 is?
And what tenders are.
Yeah. Section 106. I don't think they're going to exist much longer, so it might not be very useful, but it's a planning condition. So it's a way of putting back into the community of a big development. So it's meant to pay back directly to residents for kind of inconvenience and dirt and trucks and that sort of thing. So often it'll be, okay, you as part of building this blah blah blah, you can do up the playground opposite, or you can improve the paving. So the Packington Estate is now about to be completed for the third iteration of homes on this site. So in the late 19th century, terrace streets were built here, and by the early 60s they were owned by I think what we'd call slum landlords now, but they were in a really bad state, as was a lot of Islington. And the local authority decided to do a big compulsory purchase and build, I think it was about, I love it because I used to know all the numbers and they've gone, but say it was 650, something like that, homes. And a very extraordinary estate connected by bridges, big, concrete. The panels were baked. The elders who watched that being built talk about them being baked on site. And I think by the early 80s it was already a really problematic neighbourhood, and that was very much blamed on, as many places, blamed on the architecture rather than something other social and economic conditions. But the bridges were ripped down, I think, in the sometime in the 90s. There were massive drugs running problems here, and it was seen to be a kind of no-go zone. Talking to people who lived on the estate, maybe it wasn't really like that. And actually the flats were beautifully designed, they were really amazing, they all had double aspect, and they were quite light, and they were stacked so that you were never above someone else's bedroom. You know, there are these kind of considerations about domestic or about neighbouring, I think, that are really important. And of course, a lot of people prefer this form of architecture, but a lot of the residents who lived on the estate, for the old estate as it's now known, for a long time, talked about the walkways being such valuable places of interaction. You know, how do you know your neighbours? And now it's separate stairwells. So the estate was condemned. I think there were some problems with the gas installations as well, which is one of the kind of official lines, but who knows why this estate was chosen to be entirely demolished. So, but what I'm so fascinated by, that's 3 different architectural iterations in 50 years. So Kathy, for example, lived in the terraces. She was brought up in Ireland, came to London, lived in the terraces, then lived in the brand new flats. Then she's now watched the whole estate being redeveloped over 12 years. So the community's lived with cranes and demolitions and contractors for a long time. Oh, so we found out that the Housing Association were doing a tender for what they called a community arts programme through, and it was actually went back to North Woolwich. Someone who works in Newham Council was asked if they knew people who might be interested in this project. And then I came actually to a Q&A in this room and went away probably thinking best to stay away from that. But I guess the way that I start as an individual practitioner and AIR, I think that's the kind of core methodology, is with the place. So if we know there's a possibility of being somewhere, then it's a question of spending some time there. And then it's like sequencing, because in North Woolwich there was an official commissioning process. So I didn't want to start, you don't want to start talking to people because you're not there, you have no invitation to be there, there's no kind of permission of any kind. So what I do is take my body to that place and just do a lot of walking and a lot of being somewhere. And I guess it's listening in different ways without intruding on a place and asking of people, because the exchange hasn't started at that point. So here I walked around. There were people I knew who knew the neighbourhood a bit, so talked about a bit, but then had to come up with, this is the difficulty in a way, to get the gig you have to make some kind of proposal. And I suppose the danger there is you then fix it to that, because of course it's got a shape and you've got to know it and you're kind of comfortable with it, and it's come out of experiences of other places, but it hasn't come out of this place. So what we try to do is set up enough of a framework or enough of a structure, I suppose, for the commissioners, whoever they are, or the funders, to trust that something's going to be delivered, but to try and keep that open. So lots of the things, so you've just been in the Packington Gallery. We had no sense that there would be a Packington Gallery as part of this project, but that became clear as something we needed to do. So it had a loose shape in a tender document about this is what we could do and this is how long it would take. But it has changed a lot. I would like to push that much more, really. And that was the incredible thing about Archway and being funded through the university, the kind of, I suppose, more like a research unit, because we were just there. So it's about being entirely responsive, not just the artworks being responsive to the place, but as you said, the structure of AIR. And I actually rather not use the word project, because it's like where we are at the moment. So this place is where we are, and what we do is in response to not just what we encounter, because who's the we there? The we's changing and growing. And then in terms of the artists we work with, increasingly AIR becomes more confident to have a more open process of who the artists, let me rephrase that. So in the Packington, there was enough time, we made sure in the design of the project, there was enough time to establish a conversation with people who live here, and a bit of people who work here, but mainly people who live here, and then offer the suggestion that we could invite some artists to come and make some temporary works, and then looked at a number of artists' practices, artists I'd already spoken to and said, would you be interested in this? Are you available? Artists I know have the skills and generosity to work in this kind of way. And then the group named the Packington Producers, who were aged, it's a fairly fluid membership, but between sort of 8, 9 and mid-80s, had fantastic discussions week after week, because this stuff takes time, and chose Dimitri, Shepherd and Claudia. And so that is a really different way of progressing, developing the structure. And at that point, initially I'd imagined that for the permanent work, which was part of our delivery, that's the one thing we had to deliver. Everything else we kind of created or conceived of. The permanent work, I don't know why, looking back, I'd imagined that we'd do another selection process, but of course those artists had been working away with people, and it seemed obvious first of all go to them and say, have you got any thoughts about how on earth do we make a permanent work of art in the Packington? And they all had some thoughts, and Dimitri had a really extraordinary idea, and the Packington producer said, yes, let's go with that. So, yeah, we wouldn't have known that before. So the Hyde Group is a big housing association. I think they've got 55,000 properties in London and the South East. And they took on the role or responsibility of rebuilding the estate. So it gets handed over from the council to them. And that was in, I think that was in 2005 or 6 that process started. And as part of the original planning condition, I think in 2007 it was made, was that there would be £300,000 spent on public art. Now, given that the whole development, I think it's £130 million, so you're talking about this kind of tiny fraction. And I think it's great that there is this kind of, there are lots of other planning conditions as well, this is just one. But what's bizarre is that what public art could be is not, there are no demands made on what it might be. It's implied that it's permanent, but as the young people I was working with here asked, what does permanent mean? Because if an estate only lasts 40 years, and the new homes actually don't feel somehow very permanent either. So I think it's a really important question, what permanent is in a place. So I'm not clear about the first 200,000, but with each phase there were various, I think mostly they were mural-based projects which don't exist. There's a small mosaic in the park, I think you saw, which I rather like. It's not particularly challenging art, but there's something quite satisfying about its longevity, actually. And then there was this last 100,000, and I think, as often, it came down to a pretty sound thinker in Hyde who said, okay, we can do more of that physical stuff, or we can think more about the social infrastructure, and can we use that money to test out a kind of community-wide arts programme. So that's where they put a tender out that was pretty vague, really. And actually I was having a conversation with someone yesterday, and maybe this is a question for another day, but does it matter if the people who ask you to make the art don't really care about the art, aren't really interested in art? And I think that's one of the problems we've got on our hands. And it's really well-meaning, but it's a little bit of, if we do some art, then something happen. But those people don't become part of the project. They're too busy, they've got other things, they've got this, that. And I think that's a problem. I want to invite the conversations to be to really reach across horizontally a place like this. Claudia made a film using a drone, and she made portraits, waving portraits of about just over 100 residents, and they were greeting their neighbours, and that was from six or seven stories across canals, across streets, across parks, and this idea of in and out of the estate, across the estate, so not just Packington, but neighbouring streets and properties. And the film was shown at the end of the summer on these giant projection screens in the New Square, just for one evening. Dimitri came here his first visit was on a really hot day, and all the trees, and it's that amazing response that an artist makes when he didn't really know the history, but he kind of had a sense of something was missing. And what was missing was, anything old, because everything was taken away. I remember him saying, is there something that's like left? And I suppose we're used to that's like nostalgic, a bit of a wall or a bit of something. There were 30 plus mature trees, and they'd all been lost. And I think when we walked down to the canal and there were a few older trees, he realised it was the lack of trees. He said, I think we need a spot of shade. And then this idea developed around the palm tree, and I guess so many people in these kind of communities, particularly in London, have come from across the world, and or go across the world for their holidays, and they said, what does a spot of shade mean? What does it offer? And he made a mobile palm tree. So the palm tree was on a trolley, and he could take it to a different place in the estate each day to make it, and then people would just come along and help him make the tree. And at the end there was the palm tree picnic, and there was some abuse because people thought it was a real tree that we cut down. And we were saying, no, we made the tree. No, you didn't, you cut it down. So this kind of, I think that was important, what's real and what isn't real, and how can we test that out.
And he turned to me and was like, it's an act, right? And I was like, no.
And then Shepherd made a mobile recording studio, so the gold trolley that you saw in the gallery today, and he set off around the Packington with one or more of us, in tow, and gathered noises and sounds, and he has an amazing ability for people to trust him and stuff comes out. And so whether it was a little bit of song or the inevitable story about the good old days, but he brings this stuff together in a really respectful and quite surprising way, I think. Puts sounds alongside each other that maybe aren't meant to be, and that intimacy that is found is really beautiful. And he, at the end, it was a 4-channel work, so he made 4 trolleys with a bunch of the Packington producers, the young people, and they took these trolleys on a procession, I guess, a promenade across the estate.
When it comes to this way of working, have you found limits to have you found any limits to this way of working that you might not have overcome yet, or you've seen other people who work similarly reach?
It's a slightly confusing question. Limits on a personal level or the organisation?
The organisation,
Politically, is there a limit to what you... Not politically, but I guess...
No, it is political. So one of the things that in King's Cross we found was the limits is the funding question. And I remember a conversation with Tilly where I said, I think we should say no more money ever from developers. And Tilly's so much wiser than me. She said, maybe it's best not to say never. And of course, Hyde is a housing association, but it is a developer. We are working with developers' money. So the limits... I tend to think that limits are really good things, because limits make you ask questions and go, okay, often in my teaching projects, I would think that's all I'm doing is introducing a few boundaries so that then people can push against them. So limits are something to push against and work with and ask better questions. So the funding one will always be there. I guess the scale one is key for me. So and I think this is... No, it's not just me. As a small organisation, that preciousness, that nimbleness we talked about, being small, is a huge limit as well. I think maybe there's really interesting limits in terms of numbers and up to that scale again, but how big is a place? So in the Packington Open, we talked about the neighbourhood, and we've said it's really interesting. Packington Estate happens to sit in the middle of the ward, so we were able to say let's use the ward. So a political boundary then becomes a useful limit of are you local? Because of course local can have many different definitions.
Can you maybe expand on the limits of scale as an organisation? Because I think...
Okay.
I feel like we seem problem.
So could there be 6 of you, and then you could write six times the amount of stuff? It's a different thing, isn't it? So we were approached to run a project for a local authority, and it was in 11 estates. And part of me was like, this would be fantastic, because we could... But then I realised that what the job was to sit at a desk remote from those 11 places, and I don't know how to do that. And the people that I enjoy working with, that we collaborate with often, that are part of AIR, don't know how to work in that way. So that's someone else's methodology, and you can't just adopt someone else's way of doing things. Well, I don't think I can after 30 years at it.
Listen, baby, ain't no mountain high, ain't no valley low, ain't no river wide enough, baby.